The women in my family, my grandmother, my mother, my aunt, and now to a less extent me, are very critical, judgmental, and negative, and they love to voice their own opinions. When I'm around them, I'm very conscious of this, especially their judgment of other people. Do you have any suggestions on how to best deal with this, especially when they're being judgmental about other family members and I don't want to get involved in the conversation? I've tried to minimize my engagement in the conversation by making neutral comments and generally trying to steer the conversation in another direction, but would love your thoughts. This is so hard. And when I say hard, I mean like it's just crunchy and weird, because you found yourself, and this is why the community of the hub is such an important component of the work, because inevitably when you start doing this work, you are going to go off in one direction and not everyone is going to follow. And sometimes they follow a bit later. Sometimes they don't need to follow. Sometimes they do follow and that's great. But a lot of the time, especially in the early days of your personal spiritual development, you will feel or notice a lag between where you're at and where some of the people that you really love in your life are at. And especially when it's family members, because there is that additional emotional tie there, and there's a lot of triggers attached to it. So, you'll begin to see, like you have, that, there are some behaviors going on in your family unit that you yourself have adopted, because why wouldn't you? It's natural to do so. And now you're unhappy with those behaviors and you don't want to fall in line with those behaviors and they make you feel really uncomfortable. So know what you do about that. I think the approach that you're already using is a fantastic one, which is to disengage from the conversation as much as possible and steer the conversation into a different direction. You are going to have to use your discernment, your wisdom, and your judgment to decide whether or not it needs a conversation. I would say that normally your silence and your reluctance to be part of those conversations speaks louder than you saying, hey guys, I'm not bitching about people anymore. Hey, I don't want to have this conversation. Hey, let's put this conversation down. The other thing is that you want to try and avoid the confrontation. A lot of the time just your silence will be enough to indicate that you're not really into this conversation anymore. And that would be the approach that I would certainly take. And then if someone, directly said to me, or what's wrong, or why aren't you engaging in this conversation, or what's your opinions here, I would just respond with, look, I actually don't think it's my business to have an opinion in this particular matter. I don't necessarily agree with what she's doing, but, it's her life and it's not mine. So I would stay really neutral. I wouldn't try then to, turn around to them and be like, you should stop bitching. I'm not bitching anymore, because that's just going to create a wider gap of polarity. So meet them in a neutral territory, which is like, I just don't really see it's any of my business. I think I've got better things to talk about than, showering up the road or whatever. The interesting thing for you, or not necessarily, the interesting thing for me, whenever I have come across this, whether it's been in a family context or a social context, sorry, my dog and I are having a tug of war in the background, but it's the only thing that's keeping him quiet. When I have come up against this type of experience, one of the things that I have found is that it's less hard to manage other people and more hard to manage myself. The pull and the compulsion to engage in the conversation because it's familiar, because it makes me feel connected, because it makes me feel like I belong, because it makes me feel liked and loved by these people, that pull is really strong. And so sometimes it has taken Herculean effort for me not to engage in that conversation. And sometimes I have engaged in that conversation, even though there's a part of me being like, I don't want to be in this conversation. I don't want to be this person. And I've opened my mouth and I found myself being like, oh yeah, she is a bit like that, isn't she? Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And so the uncomfortable part for me, certainly in my experience, and I can only ever speak from my experience and observation, but for me, the uncomfortable part has been less about not engaging in the conversation and more about worrying about where my place now is if I'm not in the conversation. And so the best way that I have found to manage this is to deeply connect to myself on a consistent and constant basis through the form of meditation and self-awareness. I call this a spiritual practice, so that I can in those moments of, I'll call it weakness, right? Those moments of weakness when my humanness takes over, my desire to be liked, my desire to belong, my desire to connect is stronger than my will to come from a place of love and compassion at all times and always see unity over the division. When I find myself being pulled into those conversations, it's just, I have to apply a lot of forgiveness and a lot of compassion to myself. And I have to remind myself that I'm allowed to fuck it up. And it's okay that I get pulled to the dark side sometimes. And I just have to really pull myself out of beating myself up for it. So again, it's not like letting yourself off the hook. It's not living outside of your integrity. It's not like being, I know I shouldn't have this conversation, but I'm going to have it anyway. It's like, fuck, I had that conversation again. All right, okay, cool, all good. Next time I'm going to do better. Next time I'm going to do better. Next time I'm going to do better. And I've actually had an experience of this where I did say to a group of friends, I was like, I'm no longer bitching about anyone. I'm no longer speaking about anyone else. And you know, I don't have particularly bitchy friends, right? I don't hang out with particularly bitchy people, but I had felt it necessary to announce to these friends that I, Emily Chapon, from here on in was only ever going to be in love and compare, like, what a knob. And all that did was create more of a division. So and made me feel like I created my own ostracization, if that makes sense. So the advice, I suppose, that I would have for you, or to offer you my experience in this matter, is to use your silence and come to a place of neutrality, because what you are trying to do is to create more unity in the world. And by showing more division, or by creating more division, that's going to have the opposite effect, right? So, like, come from a completely neutral place, a non-judgmental place of their judgment. And that's really hard, because your humanness is there going like, you fucking bitching all the time. And then you become the judger of the people who are judging, right? So, like, all of these experiences are probably, well, they happen to me anyway. So, you know, it's about self-awareness. It's about self-reflection. It's about being very kind and compassionate to yourself, and very kind and compassionate to other people, like having that lens on. And when you feel that lens slip, just being like, love, kind, compassion. And it will be a journey. You know, it is not your responsibility to get other people to stop bitching. It is only your responsibility to continuously, as much as possible, sit inside of your own integrity. If you get pushed back, you know, that you'll have to use your discernment and your judgment to know how to best deal with that. A lot of the time, pushback doesn't really happen. People are just a bit more like, oh, like, they just kind of like unconsciously notice the shift in you, as opposed to, you know, you necessarily needing to bring their conscious awareness to it. So let me know if that has helped. The final countdown. I don't know where that came from. Here for the songs and the tangents.